guests are Ray De Jesus, Chief Procurement Officer at PLDT Inc., and Rahul Garg, Founder and CEO at Moglix. Thanks so much for joining us today, both of you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. Now, the panels of these events are always some of the highlights for me, as there's so much to cover and so little time to do it. So what we'll start with is looking at the key elements you both consider are essential when developing a really effective supply chain and procurement strategy. For both of you, where do you think the essential parts are? Rahul, I'll start with you.
See, I think there have been standard things that a procurement guy does in terms of the costing and things like that. But I would say that the three additional things which have become very important in the last few years. First is, how are you managing your risk across global supply chain? Second, how you are building towards a more sustainable supply chain. And the third thing, which I would say is becoming more and more prominent, is how is AI going to disrupt your digital journey if you have started a digital journey? If you have not started a digital journey, then that itself is a problem. But how are you creating digital procurement with AI at the heart of it? I think these are three very important problems that have probably been happening over the last year or so.
Ray, over to you.
For me, I think what we should be looking at in terms of procurement is ESG. So traditionally, procurement has always been a cost-saving function in the organization. But with more and more things being purchased and with the advancement of technology, we should also be looking at how do we impact overall sustainability and environmental goals.
Now that is very interesting, because I was talking earlier in a previous panel about how resilience has become a key foundation. ESG has now become a key foundation. It isn't just about cost savings, isn't just about the cash, which makes a change, I guess, within the field of procurement and supply chain. Let's look at that in a bit more detail, because we were talking there about the introduction of AI, which may mean a diversion for people in their digital strategies. If someone has started down a digital path, and now Gen AI is appearing into their plans, how do you go about pivoting into that if you've already set up a strategy heading down a different direction?
So I can take that question. So I think if you look at it, procurement organizations across the world, and we work with many of them, even across industry verticals, I think firstly, the digital journey has been quite patchy. And there have been multiple data silos inside the organization, the master data of both the products that you're purchasing, the suppliers from which you are purchasing. Those have not been fully streamlined. Now, what happens is when AI comes into picture, the power of AI is with the data. So now if you have data sitting in silos, your digital journey sitting in silos, it starts to become not so efficient for AI algorithms to work on it, improve upon it, make suggestions. One of the sort of successful implementations we have seen is that the product master data has been completely transformed using AI. And now that is using the power of language learning models, that is starting to look at. Now that was possible because that's one thing which is typically central in the organization. But when you think about the journeys, I think all of them have to be rethought with the AI at the heart of it, rather than just going and implementing some digital systems and then thinking of AI as an afterthought.
Ray, do you want to pick up on that?
Sure. When you want to implement AI, you don't look at it from one department alone. It's a culture. It's a strategy. So you cannot have one function within a company that's pushing for AI, as an example, procurement or supply chain, but the rest of the organization is not suitable to implement it. So in our case, you have to have a holistic technology or digitalization strategy embodied on the culture or the strategic imperatives of your organization. Otherwise, you can buy the most expensive AI tool or AI platform, but the way to execute and fully utilize them might not be there in the company.
Well, let's open that up a little bit further, because the ideal is to get the rest of the business and organisation involved in that project. The killer question is, how do you actually go about doing that effectively?
So I think we have seen culture is almost a very, very important element of how companies will be able to differentiate themselves and compete and win. And it's almost like there are organizations which get it and there are organizations which don't. It's funny how binary it can become, because you almost, if you walk into Moglex, if you walk into, I'm sure, Amazon or some of the food delivery companies, I mean, the culture is like, just embrace the change, think about how it can make the life better and go with it, no questions asked. And then there are organizations where the culture will be that if there is any change, even if it seems very, very obvious, you have to put barriers to it, either a defense mechanism as if someone is attacking you or so on and so forth, right? So I almost see a binary aspect of culture and the organizations which we are able to create the culture, like the number one. The startups obviously have been a proxy for those kind of culture. I think are going to benefit disproportionately with this disruption versus the others.
In my view, Neil, is the people. So you can have, the most expensive tools, systems in place, but if you don't have the people buying into it, so you have to have the right set of people and the right set of people with skills to be able to implement it properly. So I think, to add to what Rahul mentioned, assessing the profile of the employees that you have, upskilling them if needed, or buying talent or skill set that really is in tune with AI or digitization can help drive execution of AI, not just in procurement and supply chain, but the rest of the organization.
Now, Rahul, I love the way you phrased that just there about people either get it or they don't. And I'm sure there's plenty of people watching today, they're in an organisation where they know whether they're an organisation that gets it or doesn't get it. So let's talk to the people who are in an organisation that currently doesn't get it. They know they're in a situation where they're getting barriers put up around them, they're trying to go through a transformation or introduce a new strategy, and they're facing barriers and problems because you're changing things from how things have always been done. For both of you, obviously you're both within organisations that do get it. How do you break down those barriers and get other people to come along with you when you're trying to adopt a new strategy?
So I would think it comes out of two emotional aspects. One is arrogance and second is fear. And we've seen organizations who are not able to because they are arrogant, because they think that they are the best, and they take some small set of peers and define that they are probably doing better than the others. Now, the world is becoming flatter. Now, if you take automotive as an example, Tesla is probably the largest disruptor. They didn't come from the auto industry. So with the change that we are seeing, people are disrupting industries from various directions which were not possible 10, 20 years back. So therefore, I think that letting go of that arrogance is very important, because if you're arrogant and thinking about your own silo of, for example, somebody who's making a toothpaste, he thinks that I make the best toothpaste, I don't care about anything else. Or somebody who's making kind of a small medicine or something. I mean, so those are people that have to come out of this arrogance, because the industries are going to be disrupted across with technology. The second one is fear. I think the fear emanates from kind of lack of self-confidence, and people use then various excuses to not express that actually they are afraid. They use more excuses to not go with the change. So I think somewhere the organization leadership has to work on these two aspects very carefully and figure out few people in the organization who may not exhibit this characteristic and make them enable the change across the organization.
And to what Rahul just mentioned, to add to it, I think organization needs to not look at this as an investment, but look at this as an opportunity. The world is changing. Leading organizations uses digitization tools, not just AI, everything that's out there, machine learning, RPA, all the new technologies that are exciting, but really understanding how to harness the benefit of it is what organization should look at. So for me, developing that technology roadmap or technology strategy, integrating it or identifying a team that would be responsible in implementing and determining the value of it should be the focus area for those organizations that doesn't adopt or understand the value of these new technology tools like AI.
Well, Ray, a moment ago you were talking about ESG and the importance of that. So let's loop back to that, because it'd be remiss of us not to cover that, because it's hardwired into every part of a business now. Or if it isn't, it certainly should be. For you, how does ESG sustainability play a role in how modern procurement and supply chain strategies are formed?
As I mentioned, Neil, we're not just an organization that will deliver cost savings, or for supply chain, an organization that fulfill the delivery requirements or the supply chain requirements of the organization. Modern procurement and supply chain is looked at how do we impact the other items that are outside of our immediate area of responsibility. So it's very critical to determine your environmental impact. So you can apply multiple technologies like scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, or how does your product is being recycled, but just integrating it inside the supply chain and procurement KPIs or goals, so that at least the entire organization or department is pushing forward with those objectives. From a sustainable aspect, are you looking at buying the most competitive or lowest product? But have you looked at on how it was manufactured? So including elements in how you select suppliers, on how they buy or manufacture their products sustainably is also an integral part of modern procurement. So not just looking at cost, but looking at how it's being manufactured and how it's going to be disposed. So from womb to tomb, cradle to grave, the entire life cycle of all products that procurement buys.
Rahul?
Yeah, and I would think many organizations that we work with, they talk about sustainability, they talk about ESG. However, when they are defining goals within the organization, they say, I want to be cost neutral, or actually this should be giving even more cost benefits. Now, that mindset actually needs to change, because many of these changes in the short term might not be cost neutral, because you can't say that there is a cost of disposal, there is a cost of maybe the kind of material that may get used if you want to make a more environment friendly product, things like that. So I think it's very important that when companies are thinking about ESG strategy, they have to start thinking about it. What does it look like in short term? And if there is a cost escalation associated with it, willing to invest and assuming that over a period of medium to long term, they'll be able to get to the cost goals. Just saying this comes on top of it for free, even in short term, may not be the right strategy.
Now, one thing we've started to touch on is how procurement and supply chain operations within a business can start to integrate and collaborate with the rest of the business. I was at SAP Connect at the end part of last year in Vienna. I remember Tosha Thurman on stage and said, I believe her expression was, during the pandemic, procurement came to play and it's now here to stay, as in it's moved away from a back office function to being really at the top table of a business now in terms of strategy. What advice would both of you have of integrating the procurement and supply chain operations into the wider decision-making process within a business, because it no longer is an admin function. It is crucial to the success of a business. If I may, Rahul.
So yes. I think it starts with the organization structure. In most of the council or conferences that I've attended, I always hear this. procurement and supply chain should have a seat in the table. That means procurement and supply chain has to have a voice rather than being looked at as a back office function. Because when you have a seat in the table, when you can contribute in developing long-term strategies in the organization, that immediately gives value to all the new initiatives that procurement and supply chain can contribute. So if the organization is set up in that manner, wherein procurement is heard as an opinion in developing strategies, I think the second point is moving them from, instead of a cost saving department, to a business enabling department. Because at the end of the day, procurement is here not to negotiate and get the lowest cost, but to deliver the best value available in all the products and services that we're buying, so that when you get that entered into your supply chain, you can deliver or manufacture the best product or services for the end customer.
Yeah. So I would agree. Org structure is very important. I do think that the importance of procurement and supply chain probably zoomed 10x during the COVID and during the global supply chain disruption. Even today, we are thinking and talking about Red Sea and many other aspects around it, right? So, however, I feel if it went to 10x in the COVID times, it's probably come back to 2x. So because we sometimes have short-term memory of how important procurement and supply chain is. So definitely pre-COVID, it has moved ahead, but I think there needs to be still stronger voice of procurement in decision-making versus what I see still amongst the organization.
Well, we've looked a lot internally within our organisations about how to implement a strategy and an effective strategy. Let's look the other way. Let's look outside of the organisation. How do you make sure that your key stakeholders, your key procurement partners, are on board with the strategy and really engage with it? Because if they're not on board, you can have the most wonderful strategy in the world, but if they're not playing as they should do with you, we've got a problem. From your experience, what's the best way to make sure that the procurement ecosystem really works alongside you?
I think it should always start with what is the business goal. So procurement shouldn't have an isolated goal, but it should follow the business goal of the company. As an example, our goal right now shouldn't be just to save cost, but how do we enable the entire business to accelerate the revenue? How do we enable the business to reach new markets? How do we enable the business to deploy new tools that can deliver better customer service to our end customer? So with those business objectives or business goals, procurement needs to define what can we do to be able to achieve those business goals. So if we want to increase our revenue, then we need to buy our products with the fastest delivery lead time and get it installed immediately so that we can monetize our investment. If we want to develop new services and give it to our customer, then we need to find new platforms, new systems that will enable us to do so. If we want to reach new market, then we need to identify suppliers that can help us tap those new opportunities. So when the procurement goals is closely aligned to the business goal or enabling the business goal, I think that's wherein we drive the most value for the organization.
I would think thinking externally, it is very important that if you are expecting suppliers or your network to work in the strategic interest or strategic partner, that kind of conversation, that kind of partnership has to be demonstrated. Many a times I've seen large organizations may struggle because they may say that I want you to do XYZ, but then there will be scenarios where they will eventually not necessarily think of them as a strategic partner, they will think of them as a vendor. So there's a sort of a slight difference between thinking of someone as a strategic partner and a vendor. And you can't behave differently based on whatever the scenario exists for the organization, because that So I think as long as companies start to think of strategic partnerships, I think these kind of goals can be established. But if the behavior of the organization is sometimes opportunistic, cost-driven, spot-driven, then those relationships will not lead to these kind of strategic partnerships or goals being shared between the organization and the vendor network.
Now, earlier on, we were talking about the importance of flexibility, particularly when it came to AI. So let's open that up a little bit further and talk about course correction, because the strategy, when it initially goes down on paper, it could be fantastic. It could look like the ideal strategy for the organisation. But once it gets out into the wild, if you know what I mean, it starts operating within the business, there might not be things that are perfect. How do you go about analysing the strategy once it's actually up and running, and be honest and humble enough to correct it if it isn't going right? How do you go about that sort of approach?
I would say we in the organization think it's 10% strategy, 90% execution. And sometimes, I mean, the importance is that a lot of times strategy guys would want to take the glory that we know. There's generally a syndrome that people will say, we got the strategy right, execution has failed. But there is so much iterations and learnings which need to happen at the execution stage, because the strategy cannot define the last leaf of what needs to be done. So I think that collaboration between the strategy and the execution, and continuously iterating with the steer com or a process being set so that the change success is both a responsibility of someone crafting a strategy and the execution team, is how we have seen the strategy actually getting executed. But if there are people or organizations which say, this is a strategy, now let me just give this PowerPoint to a team to go out and execute, and if it doesn't succeed, I blame them. I think that's not how we have seen the strategy getting successfully executed.
And I think better to try implement digitization or new tools than not starting at all. So the hardest part of going through any digitalization initiative is having that courage to start. I think there's always going to be room for improvement or room for adjustment. But I think part of any transformation or implementation will always have to have that room to be able to course correct, to be able to identify that this might not be the right solution, or we might not have the right solution now, and we need to add more or customize it to make it better. But I think acknowledging that this will happen, and acknowledging that this will always be challenging and difficult because this is transformation. So I think creating that transformation office would be able to help them course correct. So when you start any transformation or any digitization initiative, creating that group, that room that will program manage this entire initiative or project would be able to help determine whenever there's a need to course correct.
I really think this conversation about execution just isn't had enough, to be honest, because it's something that's often forgotten. I'm not sure if we've lost Raul. Hopefully we'll be able to get him back in a moment. There he is. We found him again. There we are. So just returning to the conversation about execution, as I don't think that is discussed enough. We see plenty of strategies, fantastic looking documents, but not enough discussion about how it's actually delivered. Do you both really feel it is bringing those two sides together to make sure those who are responsible for the strategy are also responsible for seeing it through to the end?
Absolutely. I think if you create an ivory tower kind of a thought process, and we see consulting getting disrupted pretty much, that if your strategy is not executable or doesn't get executed, it's a flaw in the strategy. And many a times we see strategy becomes kind of iterative, or the way the strategy gets implemented gets iterated as you execute through it. So there is no longer a time that, and strategy, I think, evolved from a very capex-oriented mindset where you had like a big manufacturing plant to put that was the strategy, and therefore, so I think in the new age world where you're talking about knowledge, digital, people behavior, all of those, I think the strategy is a lot more about execution and iterating to perfect it.
For me, my view on implementation is that there will be organizations that can wait for like a month, for like a year, 2 years to complete a transformation program. And there will be organizations that needs it to be done in sprints, like completed in 3 months, in 6 months, 9 months, or 12. It depends on the culture. But the most important aspect to recognize when you implement any digitization initiative is that it has to have a clear output, because strategy changes, business imperatives changes. It depends on external market factors, or even internal organizational priorities. So any change in both external and external can impact the change to all of your transformation or implementation initiatives. So creating quick sprints for some organizations might be much more applicable, but definitely whoever creates the strategy should always be part of it until it gets fully executed.
Now, I'm not wanting to dwell on the negative for too long, such as poor implementation or execution. But what I'd be really interested to hear are your thoughts on other common mistakes or traps people can fall into with their strategies that stop it being as effective as it could be. Obviously, I'm not going to ask you to name names from the industry. I wouldn't do that to you. But from your experience, what do you see as the common traps people fall into and the common mistakes when they're assembling a strategy to stop it being effective?
So the traps during a strategy formulation, again, I think first can be arrogance. So these are all behavioral traits, I would say. The second one that I would say is not having enough ears to the ground, because it is very important that you need to know what is happening at the last leg before you formulate a strategy. And third thing is, what works for sometimes one organization doesn't work for the other organization. So sometimes we see too much of this, it worked in X, let's just copy it to Y, without thinking enough first principles on why did it work in X, and then how do you sort of analyze your current scenario to make sure that it will succeed in your environment. So I think these are three things that I would say in the strategy formulation is very, very important to make it successful.
For me, accountability. Identifying the teams that are accountable to deploy a particular program or strategy in the organization. So you can have a very well-written strategy impacting business goals or business priorities, but if there's no clear accountable team or people or individual that will help sponsor this at the top of the organization, provide that guidance at the operating committee, and communicating it downwards, that's very important so that you can keep the organization moving forward, address all challenges as it arise, and keeping everyone on the same page. So accountability is very, very critical.
No, I'm so glad you brought that up. I believe that is absolutely crucial, because it means everyone's got to buy in. And if everyone's got to buy in, then everyone wants it to succeed. Another area I wanted to move into, and Rahul, you started to move into this area a little bit when it comes to ears to the ground. One theme I've been exploring on the show today has been the importance of being aware of how different regions differ. So, for example, a strategy that might work in Europe might not work in Africa. A strategy that works in Asia might not work in North America, for example. How important is it that we're aware of different cultures, different marketplaces, different pressures and challenges that happen in different areas?
No, it is very important, because there is clear transferability of principles. And in fact, I would think maybe many a times the strategy can be transferable, but execution differs. So because it can differ based on the skill set of the people in that region. It can differ based on the consumer behavior for the organization. It can differ based on the level of digitization that is happening in that ecosystem. So I think many a times we might again over-index on the strategy, and strategy may have components which are transferable, but you need to make sure that the spirit of strategy is transferable in the context of execution in that market.
So the regional aspect is very critical, Neil, because that touches on the people side of it, culture. So as an example, there will be cultures wherein they want to build a specific level of relationships between a supplier and internal parties that makes the project run much more smoother. There will be culture wherein these are the set of requirements, you have to deliver this. Otherwise, we just change our third-party partners that's in charge of the implementation. So I think each region possesses a different type of culture outside of the own company culture. Second, the availability of quality third-party vendors is also a big differentiation per region, because I believe that each region will have a strong area wherein they will have a lot of technology suppliers or a lot of marketing suppliers or a lot of raw material suppliers. So that's not prevalent, that's not available in other regions. So availability of supply or quality of suppliers and also cultural organization varies per region.
What I want to move on to next is something we haven't really touched on, and that is managing risk and building resilience into a strategy. We've seen over the last few years so many different pressures that have been on procurement and supply chains. I can't think of a time where there have been so many in recent history in such a short period of time. How do you go about hardwiring a good risk and resilience approach into your strategy at all levels?
I mean, the way we have seen organizations go about it, I think in past also people used to think of that, am I dependent on single source vendor, two source, three source? I think so that has been a common philosophy. I think it becomes more important. And now if you combine that with who is my ESG supplier or who is my ESG compliant supplier, so you're starting to have diversification of supplier, both from a basic risk perspective, ESG perspective. The third dimension which got added is the global supply chain disruption, which starts to introduce this concept of somewhere a friendly partner country and someone who may not be as friendly or whose law may be changing or not as stable or not as strategic with respect to the country-to-country relationships and partnerships. So I think if you look at it, every single supply, you have to think of all of these three dimensions now, which used to be probably only the dimension one. And I think that's very important because we saw particularly with vaccines, for example, it became like a kind of a tricky relationship between the countries. Vaccine producers sometimes hoarding or choosing preferential which countries they would send vaccines and things like that. So I think this third dimension is very unique, introduced post-COVID, and something that one needs to care about. But the first two are anyways here to stay and should become more stronger in the coming years.
I'll marry the risk and also technology that we discussed earlier. So I think from a risk perspective, the main driver there to manage it is availability of information or predictability. Of course, it cannot be managed and predicted 100 times, but at least there are available tools already backed by new technologies like AI, machine learning that would be able to determine how much of our supply chain is really risk-free or future-proof. As an example, if you have supplier A that's getting their product from their tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4 suppliers, there are tools that are AI-backed that gives us visibility on the entire supply chain of our suppliers. So if procurement and supply chain gets those tools or get that particular visibility, we can create a specific risk management strategies that can address those areas. You can create backup suppliers, you can create secondary or tertiary source depending on the data that is available to us.
Now, you've both been incredibly generous with your time this afternoon, so I'll just trouble you with one further question, and I would freely put this under the category of a shameless plug for both of you. Looking at your own procurement and supply chain strategies and operations, for each of you, what would be the one really game-changing part of your strategy that you've introduced that has really made a difference? If you just had to pick one that has made the biggest difference, what would it be?
For me, Neil, is shifting procurement goals to be able to deliver business goals. Having that business mindset instead of having just procurement mindset across the entire department is very important to me, because that also improves the profile or the capability of my procurement team to not just think about getting a penny there, a penny less, but also thinking how can that penny less impact our business objectives or an increase in our business revenue.
Rahul, I'll give you the final word on this.
Yeah. I would say while it has not completely changed it, but I would be bullish on AI and the impact it will cause on how people think about the entire technology landscape, the intelligence and the action that procurement managers will take in the future. So I would say it will remain in the next few years probably one of the largest disruptor on the technology landscape.
Well, I'll be delighted if we could revisit that in the future. Both of you, as I said, you've been incredibly generous with your time this afternoon. Fantastic advice, fantastic insight. Really appreciate you joining us here today at Procurement and Supply Chain Live Singapore.